My son said, "It's Chelsea's birthday today, Mom. We already have plans." In that moment, I knew I had just lost my husband, and perhaps my son too. If you're listening to my story, please don't scroll away. Not because I want to complain, but because maybe you've also lived through a morning that felt perfectly ordinary, right up until the moment it all came crashing down. The moment you lost someone and realized no one else saw your pain as real. I called my son, my voice choked with tears. "Your father just passed away." And all he said was, "It's my wife's birthday today. Can you call back later if you've ever faced a break like that, when your family turns away, when your loved ones meet your loss with silence? Share your story in the comments. I'll read it. Maybe I'm not the only one who has survived a shock that profound." I still remember it was a Saturday. The light spilled through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the old wooden table. Every weekend morning, Richard had a habit of waking up before me to make coffee and turn on the classical music station. I'd wander downstairs with my hair still a mess, a sweater draped over my arm, my eyes barely open. That day, he was wearing the faded gray t-shirt I used to hate because of the tear at the cuff. He called it his lucky shirt, even though it was worn to threads. He was sitting there reading the comics in the newspaper and chuckling to himself like a boy in an old man's body. I poured myself some coffee and sat across from him, spreading butter on my toast, while he recounted trivial stories about his trip to the grocery store yesterday. He told me I'd bought the powdered creamer again instead of the liquid kind he liked. Then he tapped his spoon lightly against his mug, squinting at me playfully. "If I die from this terrible powdered creamer, you'll have to live with the guilt for the rest of your life, Evie." I was mid-bite, about to joke back, but I never got the chance. The spoon fell. It hit the table, then slid to the floor with a tiny clatter that echoed like a fractured heartbeat. I looked up. Richard was frozen, his eyes wide open, his hand clenched as if in a seizure. "Richard," I called out, thinking he was still joking. He had a habit of playing those silent pranks. But there was no punchline. I scrambled around the table, my hands shaking so badly I knocked over my untouched coffee. He slumped sideways, his head falling against his shoulder. His eyes were still open, his mouth slightly parted. His chest was no longer moving. I screamed, my heart feeling like it had split in two. I slid to the floor with him, my hands fumbling for the phone, my mind a thick fog. I called 911, my voice barely a whisper, repeating our address like a machine. The operator told me to start chest compressions until the paramedics arrived. I did as I was told, but I knew from the way his hand grew cold in mine, from the slight, weightless droop of his neck, that Richard was already gone. When the police and paramedics arrived, I backed into a corner, still in my nightgown. My hair a mess. I felt unreal, like I was watching a scene from a movie about some woman sitting in shock in her kitchen barefoot, while on the floor lay the husband she had spent more than 40 years with. One of the officers, a young man with a gentle voice, asked if there was any family I needed to call. I nodded. My son, Brian. I picked up my phone, my hands still trembling even after the chaos had subsided. The phone rang 5 times. I was practically praying he would pick up. And then finally he answered. "Hello," I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear it break as I said, "Brian, it's Mom. It's your father. He's gone." A pause, a long one. Not a single question, no gasp, no sob, just silence. Then Brian said, his voice perfectly even. "It's Chelsea's birthday today, Mom. We're having a party. Can you call back later?" I thought I'd misheard him, but I hadn't. He added, "We've had this planned for a week. Everyone's already here. You know, it's important to Chelsea." I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because my throat had closed up completely. I hung up, without another word. I sat down next to the chair where Richard still lay, his eyes now gently closed by someone, his face still holding the ghost of his unfinished joke. I didn't cry. I just sat there, alone. That was the first time I truly understood what it meant to be lonely. It wasn't because I'd lost my husband. It was because I had called my son to tell him his father was dead, and he'd told me to call back later, because of his wife's birthday. I don't know if anything could hurt more than that, but I knew in that moment something inside of me had shattered, and it would never be whole again. I stood by my husband's coffin alone, and when people asked, "Where's Brian?" I could only smile and lie, but inside was a truth that left me numb. Richard's funeral was on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging so low they seemed to press down on the roof of the small church at the end of the street. I remember because I'd been awake since 5 a.m., not because I had anything to do, I just couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the indentation on the pillow next to me, as if he'd only just left a few minutes ago. I wore the old black boat-neck dress I'd once planned to throw out because it made me look older, but then kept just in case there was a funeral. Well, here it was. I just never thought it would be Richard's. I placed a photo of him from his youth on the memorial table, a picture of him in his Navy uniform holding a guitar he never learned to play a full song on. I chose his favorite music, Moon River, not because it fit the occasion, but because it was the song he always hummed while he shaved. As people began to arrive, I stood near the church entrance, shaking hands, accepting hugs and condolences, but my mind felt like it was floating somewhere else. Someone asked me, "Where's Brian?" He must be devastated. I flinched. Then I nodded the first excuse that came to mind, tumbling out. He's stuck in another state, and Chelsea is pregnant with their second. It's not safe for them to travel. I heard the words come out of my own mouth and felt disgusted with myself. I was covering for a man who couldn't even be bothered to show up to his own father's farewell. I don't know why I protected him. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the habit of a mother who was too used to carrying her children's shame. The night before the funeral, I had tried calling again. Not Brian, Chelsea. I thought that as someone who had been part of my family for nearly 10 years, she couldn't be completely heartless. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was as soft and smooth as ever. "Oh, Evelyn, I'm afraid we won't be able to make it. I'm pregnant, and the doctor advised me to avoid traveling." She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully, as if she'd rehearsed them. I could clearly hear someone laughing in the background. It sounded like a party, or at least not a space for mourning. I just said, "I see." I didn't ask any more questions. I hung up. But after I put the phone down, I stared into space for hours. One thought kept replaying in my head. Why? I'm afraid we can't make it. Why afraid and not sorry? Not, we're so devastated. The funeral was quiet. Richard's old friends and former colleagues came in full force. They shared old stories. Someone brought a newspaper clipping from 1987 when he'd been honored for his community service. I smiled at the photo of him in a suit, his hair sticking up like a bird's nest. Richard had never mastered a comb. I waited. I kept hoping Brian would walk through the door even if he was late. But he never came. Not even a text message, not a single wreath, not a word of condolence, not a single hug. 3 weeks after the funeral, I was folding blankets in the basement when the landline rang. I still kept it because Richard didn't trust those hackable cell phones. The voice on the other end was a nurse, polite and professional. "Is this Mrs. Whitaker? We need to confirm a relative for patient Brian Whitaker to update his insurance file. He's currently receiving treatment at Eastlake Medical Center." I froze. Treatment for what I asked. "I'm afraid I can't disclose the details, but it's related to an issue with infertility. He's no longer able to conceive naturally. We need to cross-reference his genetic records with his closest family." I hung up the phone in silence. My throat was as dry as a desert. I sat down on a stool, my head in my hands. Everything clicked into place in my mind, slowly and painfully. Chelsea had said she was pregnant. Brian hadn't come to the funeral because he needed to be with his pregnant wife. But now the hospital was telling me what Brian couldn't have children. I felt something inside me crack, a small, fine fracture that let in a draft of cold air. It wasn't loud, just chilling. That was the first time I thought they lied to me. Not just about their absence, but about a baby that never existed. And if they could invent a pregnancy to avoid their own father's funeral, what else were they capable of? I stood up and walked over to the bookshelf. I took out the family photo album and sat down at the table. I looked at a picture of Brian when he was 4 with a buzz cut and chubby cheeks. I remembered how he used to cling to Richard's leg, refusing to let go, how he'd sobbed when his dad had to leave for a 2-day business trip. I looked at that boy and saw a stranger. I started cleaning out Richard's room on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after the funeral. It was colder than usual, the morning mist still clinging to the windows, and the house smelled of old blankets, mixed with the ointment he used for his knees. I hadn't touched this room for weeks other than to close the door and try not to think about it. But there comes a time when you have to face it. You can't leave the toothbrush sitting in its holder forever. You can't let his slippers stay pointed toward the bathroom as if he's just at an early meeting and will be back soon. You can't keep walking past the armchair where he watched the sports report without looking. I started by folding the thick brown jacket he wore to take out the trash. The pockets still held crumpled tissues and a flattened mint. A wool glove had fallen under the bed, and I bent down to pick it up. As I stood, my eyes fell on the small nightstand drawer Richard had always kept for himself. He never locked it, but he never invited anyone in either. I opened it. Inside were a few notebooks, a dried-up fountain pen, some faded old photos, and a soft-cover journal bound in moss-green leather. No title, no name. I picked it up, my hand trembling slightly. I opened the first page and saw his familiar script. Richard's handwriting slanted a bit, rushed, the T always crossed a little too high. Tuesday, November 8th, just transferred $5,000 to Brian. This time it was for a car accident. The way he talks, I know he's not telling the truth, but I'm not strong enough to say no. He's still our son. I flipped through a few more pages until I came to a section marked with a birthday card, a generic one that just said, "Love you, Dad." But on the back, tucked inside, was a letter folded into quarters, the paper thin and slightly yellowed. I unfolded it, and I read, "Brian, I've been silent for too long, but this silence is hurting me more than any argument ever could. I know you haven't been honest. The story about the rare illness, the frozen student loans, the time Chelsea had to be rushed to the ER, but there were no receipts I checked. And you know what I'm not angry at least not in the way you think. I'm just sad. Sad that you think your mother and I are foolish enough not to notice. Sad that you use the love we have for you as a tool to get what you want. I haven't told your mother, partly because I don't want to break her faith in you, and partly because maybe I still hope you'll fix this yourself. But now I'm tired. The next time you need help, bring the truth with you. Dad." I read the letter twice. The first time, my eyes were dry, as if the words hadn't sunk in. The second time, tears fell, not in a flood, but slowly, gently, like the tone of the letter itself. Richard knew. He knew his son was lying to him, and he hid it from me. I wasn't angry with him. I couldn't be. I only felt a cold, deep sadness, like an empty well. Maybe because I understood why he hid it. Richard was always the soft one in our family, and the one who quietly shouldered the burdens. He used to tell me, "The last thing I ever want to do is make your mother sad." And now I understood he had lived by that principle until his very last breath. I put the letter back and closed the journal, but I didn't leave it in the drawer. I carried it with me, placing it on the dining table where Richard used to sit every morning, next to the spot where he'd tap his fingers when his coffee got cold. I sat down across from the empty chair and said, "You didn't have to hide it from me, Rich. I'm a grown-up too. We should have talked about it, about Brian." No one answered. Of course not. But in that silence, I saw one thing clearly: my husband had done everything he could to protect me from this pain. And in doing so, he had carried it all by himself. I didn't burn the letter. I didn't hide it away forever. I kept it in my desk drawer next to the household budget book, as a reminder, not of Brian's deceit, but of love, which sometimes takes the form of silence. I kept the house just as it was when Richard was alive. The living room still held the scent of old wood and the leather conditioner he used on the chairs. Our small wedding photo sat on the mantel next to a dried flower pressed in a glass frame, a birthday gift from him on our 30th anniversary. He'd said, "It's dry, but it still holds its shape. Just like you, Evie." I hadn't dared to touch the master bedroom since finding the letter. That room, it now felt like a forbidden place. Not out of fear, but because it was the last place where I could feel he was still somewhere nearby. As long as I didn't fold the shirt he'd left on the chair, as long as I didn't put away the comb with a few of his silver hairs, then maybe he wasn't truly gone. Brian showed up on a Friday afternoon, no call, no warning. I had just brewed a pot of tea and was about to sit on the porch when I heard a car pull up. I glanced through the window. It was the familiar silver SUV. The door opened. Brian got out. A duffel bag in one hand, car keys dangling from the other, as if he'd just stopped by the gas station and decided to drop in on his way. I didn't see Chelsea. I didn't go out to greet him. Brian knocked twice, then pushed the door open as if he still lived here. He wore a sports jacket, wrinkled khakis, and the old sneakers I'd bought him 2 years ago. The same quick stride, the same darting eyes, no hug, no apology. I just stood in the kitchen watching him. I said nothing. He didn't come over to hug me. He walked straight into the living room and sat down in Richard's armchair as if nothing had happened. I looked at him, then at the chair. "You're sitting in your father's chair," I said, my voice flat. Brian raised an eyebrow and a half smirk on his face. "Well, I guess it doesn't matter now, does it, Mom? It's not like anyone's using it." I didn't reply. He looked around, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "You doing okay?" "Everything's still the same, I see." I remained still the same, including the silence from you after your father's funeral. Brian rubbed the back of his neck and shook his head. "Mom, I know you're angry, but we really had a reason. Chelsea was—" I cut him off. "She wasn't pregnant." He fell silent. His eyes widened, but only for a second. "The hospital called the wrong person. You know, they thought I was your wife. They told me you were being treated for infertility. They needed genetic records from a relative." The air in the room suddenly grew thick. Brian leaned back as if shoved into the chair. I poured tea. I didn't offer him any. I set the pot down on the wooden table and wiped a small spill. Every movement was slow, deliberate. I sat in the opposite chair, my fingers laced together. "You came here to ask for more money, didn't you?" Brian narrowed his eyes. "You think that's the only reason I'd come here? Then why are you here?" He slammed his hand on the table. The teacup rattled softly. "Are you digging up my father's grave just to lecture me? He's barely cold, and you're already bringing up money. Your father left me a letter. It's all in there. About all the times you lied. About the time you called crying for money for Chelsea's hospital bills. The surgery that never happened. The stock market debt. I know everything." Brian shot up from his seat, his face flushed. "That was between me and Dad. You have no right. If you raise your voice one more time, I will call the police, and I mean it, Brian." He froze. Then he sat back down, his head in his hands. The room sank into a silence so heavy it was suffocating. I pulled a linen napkin from my pocket and gently wiped the table. I stood up, very slowly. You are not a child anymore, and I am no longer a woman who will blindly believe every word you say. I pointed to the door. If you don't know how to respect me or the memory of your father, then you have no business being in this house. Brian said nothing. He just sat there, his back slumped like a man exhausted. I didn't know what he was thinking, and even if he was about to apologize, it was far too late. He stood, grabbed his bag, and walked out without looking at me. He paused at the door. I thought he might turn around. He didn't. The door closed softly. No slam. Just a soft click. But to me, it sounded like the end of something that had once been motherhood. I stood there for a long time. My eyes were dry. Maybe because I had cried enough. Or maybe because, at a certain age, grief no longer spills out in tears, but settles in your chest like a heavy stone. I sat down in my own chair, facing the empty one across from me. The one Richard used to sit in, tapping the table to call me over for morning coffee. Now, my son had just sat there, and I wondered, did Richard see that? Would he be angry, or would he just be sad like he was in his letter? I scheduled a meeting with Samuel Green for a Wednesday morning in early April. The weather was unseasonably cold. I wore an old beige turtleneck sweater, a felt hat, and brown gloves. In my hands was a portfolio I'd prepared the day before, containing a copy of Richard's letter, the list of financial transfers, and a copy of the old will he and I had signed together back in 2007. Samuel was Richard's closest friend and lawyer. They had served together in the military and had stayed in touch ever since. I'd never had to work with Samuel directly before, but Richard always used to say, "If I ever go before you, call Sam. He knows us better than anyone." Samuel's office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. It had creaky wooden stairs and frosted glass windows that showed the silhouette of an old maple tree. He was waiting for me with a cup of hot tea and a sad, knowing look. But he didn't ask any questions, beyond his first, "Where would you like to begin, Evelyn?" I took out all the documents and laid them on his desk, in order Richard's letter. The notebook with his jottings, the bank statements, showing 5 years of transfers to Brian, and finally the old will. I don't just want to amend the will, Sam. I want to rewrite it, from scratch, and I need it to be ironclad so it can't be bent or contested. Samuel sat up straighter and put on his reading glasses. In that moment, I saw his expression shift. It wasn't shock. It was the look of a man who had heard too many stories like this one. "Are you sure?" he asked. More sure than I've ever been about anything I said. I told him the whole story from Richard's death, and the call from the hospital to the letter in the journal, and the day Brian came back and yelled at me in my own living room. I spoke slowly and clearly without crying or faltering. Samuel just nodded, occasionally jotting down a note. When I got to the end, the part about throwing my own son out of my house, I paused, not because I was ashamed, but because my chest suddenly felt tight. I looked up at him. "You know, Sam, I didn't do it because I hate him. I did it because I was afraid I would keep forgiving him just like I always had. And then I would lose myself completely." Samuel nodded slowly. "You're still a mother, Evelyn, but you're also a person, and people have limits." We started drafting the new will that morning. Samuel explained every clause, every legal binding. He asked me, "Are you certain you want to remove Brian and Chelsea from the inheritance entirely?" I answered without hesitation. "I don't want what Richard left behind to become a reward for deceit. I wanted the entire estate, the house, the retirement accounts, the old pickup truck he kept in the garage, even his prized jazz record collection, to be placed in a trust fund in the name of Sophie Coraline Whitaker. Sophie would be granted access to the fund when she turned 22. Not teen, because I knew 18 was still too young to carry that weight, but not so late that she couldn't understand its value. And I added a special clause asking Samuel to write it so clearly that it could be quoted verbatim in court if needed. Any individual who engages in threats, coercion, litigation, or legal interference with the intent to alter, invalidate, or delay the execution of this will shall be deemed to be committing an act of emotional abuse against the testator and the beneficiary. In such an event, any and all of their inheritance rights shall be immediately and irrevocably voided. I never thought I'd reach a point in my life where I would have to use the phrase emotional abuse in connection with my own son. But now I understood not all cruelty is visible. Some wounds are the kind no one else can see, but they make you unable to live the way you once did. Before I left his office, I handed Samuel a sealed yellow envelope. He asked, "What's this, a handwritten letter? I want you to keep it with the file and give it to Sophie if one day I'm no longer here." Samuel nodded. He didn't ask any more questions. I knew he understood. The letter inside Dearest Sophie, if you are reading this one day, it may be because I am no longer with you, or perhaps because you need a gentle reminder from someone who believed in you when the world turned its back. I wrote this will not because I don't love your parents. I once loved them very much, but I also love truth and conscience and what is right. And I see all of those things in you. If you ever feel lost, if someone makes you doubt yourself, please read this letter again. Know that you were not wrong to choose kindness. I love you. Grandma. I went home that afternoon with a copy of the new will pressed flat in its manila envelope. I placed it in the safe in my bedroom next to the wristwatch Richard always wore and our wedding photo. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved. But I knew one thing for sure: I had just drawn a line, not to punish, but to protect what was worth protecting. It was a cloudy afternoon and a cold wind seeped through the cracks in the window frames, even though I'd shut them tight. I remember because I was checking the vent behind the stove when I heard a soft thud on the porch. Not a car, not a voice, just a quiet sound, as if someone had placed something on the front step and then disappeared. I wiped my hands on my apron and went to the door. No one was there, only a plain white envelope sealed resting on the doormat. In the corner, in a small slanted cursive, were the words, "For Grandma." I picked it up, my heart suddenly beating faster, not from fear, but because I knew that handwriting. It was Sophie's. I went inside and carefully opened the envelope with the letter opener Richard used to use. Inside there was no paper, no letter, just a small silver USB drive with no label or note. I stared at it for a moment, then sat at my desk and plugged it into Richard's old computer, the one he used to read the news and watch funny videos on every night. The screen flickered to life slowly, the fan inside whirring like an old man sighing. On the drive were 3 audio files simply named 1, In the Kitchen, MP3, 2, Saturday Night.mp33. When Dad called, MP3, I hesitated. Then I clicked on the first file. The audio begins with the clinking of silverware on plates, the distant hum of a dishwasher. Chelsea's voice came through crystal clear. "I told you, if we can prove she's no longer competent, the entire estate legally reverts to you. We just need a doctor to sign off on it." A pause. Then Brian's voice, low and even. "Yeah, Mom will just scream at the lawyers like she always does. By then, everyone will see she's unstable." Chelsea laughed. "The angrier she gets, the better it is for us." I stopped the recording right there. I couldn't listen to any more. I sat up straight, my hand still on the mouse. The room suddenly felt so quiet, I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My heart pounded with each tick as if counting down to something I could never take back. I opened the second file. The audio has a slight hiss, then the sound of hushed voices as if whispering in a bedroom. Chelsea's voice. "If we need to, I can call Dr. Jenkins and get him to write a psychological note. We only need 2 witnesses to make it stick. Brian, yeah. But don't let Sophie hear. Chelsea scoffed. That kid only ever takes her side. She doesn't understand anything, Brian. She's getting suspicious. She asked me yesterday why we didn't go to the funeral. Chelsea, just lie. Kids forget easily. I stopped it again. My throat was tight, but my eyes were dry. Not because I had no tears left, but because in that moment I understood. I wasn't the only one who had heard those words. Sophie, she had heard them, and she recorded it, not for revenge, but to protect me. I opened the 3rd file. The sound of the outdoors, a light wind blowing. Brian's voice is low as if he's standing just outside a door. Brian. Is Mom there? I just want to talk about the will. A female voice interrupts Chelsea, her tone annoyed. Brian, are you really calling to beg again? I told you it's better to just let her get old and lose her mind. Brian is silent. Chelsea continues, or maybe we could slip something in her sleepy time tea. You know, the kind that makes you temporarily confused. I could ask Lily about it. Brian. Shut up, Sophie's in the house. The recording ended with the sound of a car door slamming. I sat there stunned into silence. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just felt something inside me break, and then fall in slow motion. It wasn't because of what they said. It was because of what Sophie had done. She hadn't said a word to me. She didn't send a letter or ask for praise. She just quietly left the evidence so I would know I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being too harsh. Sophie didn't defend me with words. She defended me with the truth. I took a cloth napkin, carefully wrapped the USB drive, and placed it in a small box inside my safe right next to the new will. Then I went up to Sophie's room, the little room I always kept ready for her when she came to visit. She wasn't there, of course she was still at school, but I sat on her bed and looked around. The pillow still had an indent from her last stay. On the desk was a history book, open to a page marked with a pencil. I took the pencil and wrote a short line on a sticky note. Thank you, I know. Then I placed it inside her book without signing my name. I had no idea Sophie had done all of that on her own until a few days later, when Samuel Green called me. His voice was low and steady, but I sensed something unusual in the way he hesitated before speaking. Evelyn, I think you should know, your granddaughter came to see me, alone. I gripped the phone, sinking into my chair as if the gravity had been pulled from beneath my feet. The week before, Sophie had stayed with me for a few days during her spring break. She said she needed a change of scenery and that it was too loud to study at her parents' house. I didn't ask many questions, just prepared. Her little bedroom washed the Christmas tree print sheets she still loved and bought the cereal she'd eaten since she was a little girl, Frosted Flakes, though I never understood the appeal of something so sugary. Sophie was her usual quiet, gentle self. She spent most of her time at the desk by the window reading or working on her laptop. I noticed her take a few phone calls, but she always stepped out onto the back porch or closed her door. I assumed it was just a classmate or maybe a teacher. It turned out she was calling to make an appointment with Samuel. I guess Sophie found his business card in the file I left on my desk, I told him. I didn't lock it. I didn't think I needed to hide it. Samuel said Sophie arrived in the afternoon right on time, carrying a dark blue crossbody bag, her hair pulled back neatly. She wore a turtleneck sweater and jeans. He told me she wasn't timid, but she wasn't defiant either. The way she presented everything was incredibly clear, like someone who had thought long and hard before speaking. I know this might sound strange, Sophie had said, but I want to be sure that if my parents seek custody of me, I have the right to refuse. Samuel asked her why. Because I don't feel safe living with them. Not because they hit me, but because they threaten my grandmother. and I don't believe they'll stop." When Samuel recounted that part, I put a hand to my chest as if to keep my heart from breaking. Sophie had never said that to me directly. She was always so careful not to upset me, not to make me worry. But it turned out deep down she had been feeling unsafe for a long time. Samuel said he asked a few more questions about her home life, her schoolwork, and whether her parents had ever emotionally manipulated her. Sophie simply said, "They treat my grandmother like a burden, and they treat me like a child who doesn't know any better. But I know enough to see who is hurting who." I couldn't remember the last time I had felt so proud. Maybe it was when Sophie was in her 5th grade play, portraying Rosa Parks and declaring, "I will not move because I deserve to be here." This time Sophie wasn't moving either. After the call with Samuel, I sat in silence for a long time. I looked out the kitchen window to the spot where she usually sat eating her cereal. My hand gently touched Richard's old silver spoon, now a little tarnished but still with the perfectly round shape he'd always liked. If Richard knew, he probably would have chuckled and said, "She gets that stubbornness from you, Evie." But I didn't think it was stubbornness. I thought it was clarity and courage. That evening, after we'd cleared the dinner dishes, I called Sophie over to the table. I didn't mention the lawyer right away. I just asked softly, "Do you feel comfortable here?" Sophie nodded, smiling. "It's quiet. You don't have TikTok blasting all day." I chuckled. "If there ever comes a day when you feel you need to do something to protect someone you love, you do it. I'll understand." Sophie looked at me. Her gray-blue eyes were direct, far more mature than her years. She didn't ask, "What are you talking about?" or feign innocence. She just replied, "I know." The mediation was scheduled for a Monday morning. The law office was in a 2-story red brick building with large glass doors overlooking a parking lot and a planter of lavender that was starting to dry at the tips. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with a glass of water, my hand resting on my brown leather portfolio. Inside was everything: the new will, the USB from Sophie Richards' letter, and a few old bank statements. It wasn't much, but to me it was the truth. I never thought that at 68 I'd be sitting in a room like this, debating whether I was sane enough to decide who should inherit the house I'd been washing the windows of for 30 years. But sometimes life takes you places you never expected without any warning. Brian and Chelsea arrived 5 minutes late. They walked in silently, dressed in dark suits, their faces lacking the hostile edge from our last encounter. They sat on the other side of the table without looking at me or offering a greeting. The mediator was a woman named Karen in her 50s with her hair in a neat bun and a polite professional demeanor. She began with the usual script: "We are here today not to pass judgment but to find a solution. We are not biased toward either party, and all information presented must be based on clear evidence." I nodded. I'd heard enough unfair stories to know that today the evidence would have to speak for me. Chelsea spoke first. Her voice was soft, almost emotional. "We love Evelyn. But since Richard passed, she's changed a great deal. She's become volatile, easily agitated. One time she called Brian just to berate him for not attending the funeral. But I was pregnant at the time and needed special care." I saw Karen tilt her head slightly, jotting something down. She didn't interrupt. Chelsea continued, "We don't want to fight, but we're worried. She amended her will in a rush without consulting the family, and we're concerned she might have been influenced by someone." Brian added, his voice slow and deliberate. "Our daughter is still young, only 14. She can't be the one making decisions. It's possible someone is exploiting the bond between her and Evelyn to manipulate her thinking." At that I wanted to laugh. But instead I just opened my portfolio, took out a cream-colored folder, and placed it gently on the table in front of me. Karen turned to me. "Mrs. Whitaker, do you have a response?" I nodded. "I do. and I'd like you to hear every part of it." I opened the folder and took out a copy of the new will along with Richard's letter, the one I had kept for months. "This is a letter my husband wrote to my son but never sent. In it, he details Brian's repeated lies to get money. I don't need your sympathy. I just need the truth to be acknowledged." I then passed over the bank statements with each transfer highlighted next to excuses that never came with a receipt. Karen took them and began to read. Her expression changed slightly. It was subtle, but I noticed. I used to be a secretary. I know how people's attitudes shift when they start to believe one side. Finally, I took out the USB drive. I placed it on the table. On this drive are recordings made by my own granddaughter of conversations between Brian and his wife. I don't need to describe the contents. If necessary, we can listen to them right here. Karen leaned forward slightly. "I will need to review that content with an independent counsel, but I appreciate your thorough preparation." Brian and Chelsea were silent. Their eyes were fixed on the USB drive as if it were a foreign object. Karen continued, "For now, I will take all these documents into consideration. I'll need to review them carefully over the next 48 hours before I make a recommendation for our next mediation." Before she could finish, I saw Brian lift his hand, pretending to reach for his own file, but then his hand quickly swiped at the USB as if trying to slip it into his folder. Karen spoke immediately, her voice sharper than before. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitaker, are you attempting to remove evidence from the negotiating table?" Brian froze, his hand still hovering over the USB. "I was just going to look at it. I didn't mean anything by it." Karen stared at him, her eyes wide. She turned to her assistant and gestured for her to take a note. "I need to make a record of this behavior. This is a document belonging to the plaintiff, and you did not have permission to handle it." Chelsea turned to Brian and whispered something, her face turning from pink to pale. Brian dropped the USB back on the table and sat up straight, but he didn't look anyone in the eye for the rest of the meeting. The remainder of the session was tense. Karen repeated a few final procedures and announced the schedule for a follow-up meeting if needed. When everyone stood to leave, I gathered my files, placed them in my leather bag, neither rushing nor shaking. As I reached the door, I turned to Karen and said quietly, "Thank you for listening. Not everyone has the patience to tell fact from fiction." Karen nodded. "I haven't reached any conclusions, Mrs. Whitaker, but today I can see that you know exactly what you're doing." I thought that after the mediation they would be quiet for a while. Brian used to be the kind of kid who couldn't look me in the eye if he was caught in a lie. But that day he had tried to hide evidence right at the table in front of a mediator. That wasn't an accident. That was calculation. And that's how I knew this wasn't over. I couldn't sleep that night, even after drinking chamomile tea and reading 20 pages of an old novel. The bedside lamp cast a yellow glow on the wall where I still kept my wedding photo with Richard. Sometimes I talked to him as if he were still there. It wasn't superstition, it was just comforting to have someone to think about besides myself. I sat propped against the pillows, my phone on the nightstand. I still kept the ringer on, a habit from when Richard was alive in case of an emergency. Around 10 p.m. the phone rang. It was Brian's number. I hesitated for a few seconds. Then I answered, holding the phone to my ear without using the speaker. "Hello," I said softly. Brian's voice was gentler than I expected. "Mom, I know this might not be the time, but can you give me a few minutes?" I didn't answer right away. After a moment I said, "Go on." He sighed as if he'd been holding it in for a long time. "I think we can fix this. I'm your son after all. I know I was wrong. The money, the will, it made everything ugly. But I don't want us to be estranged like this forever." I listened, but my heart didn't stir. Not because I was heartless, but because I'd heard lines like this before. They always came after a wrongdoing, like a bandage placed over a wound that was still bleeding. Then something I never expected happened. I heard footsteps, a woman in heels walking by, and Chelsea's voice came through loud and clear from Brian's end as if she had no idea he was on the phone. "Still calling that old hag God? She's persistent. I swear if she keeps being this stubborn, I'll hire someone to intimidate her. Let her know what it feels like to be scared." I was frozen. Brian tried to hiss at his wife. "Shh, I'm talking to her right now." But it was too late. I had heard enough. I hung up immediately. My hands were shaking, but not from emotion. From anger. Anger at being disrespected, at being threatened in my own home by the very people I once called family. I took a deep breath. Then I opened my nightstand drawer and took out the old phone I used to record my calls. I'd hit record the moment I answered as a precaution. Part of me had wanted to hear my son's apology if there was one, and part of me perhaps had grown accustomed to needing proof. The recording was clear. The sound was sharp with no static. I listened to it 3 times, each time with a different emotion. The first time was pain, the second was anger, and the third was resolve. The next morning I woke up early. A light rain was falling and a thin mist coated the car windows. I put on a long coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and took my phone and a copy of the recording on a USB. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't call Samuel. I drove straight to the local police station. The precinct wasn't large. A young receptionist smiled and asked what I needed. "I'd like to speak with someone about filing a report for personal threats." I said, my voice calm. She seemed a little surprised, but nodded and asked me to wait. A few minutes later, an officer named Sanders invited me into his office. He was in his 30s, tall, with a professional demeanor. "What would you like to report, Mrs. Whitaker?" I opened my bag, took out the USB, and placed it on his desk. "On here is a recording. A woman, my daughter-in-law, states her clear intention to hire someone to threaten me." It wasn't a slip of the tongue. Her tone was completely serious. "I want to file a report. I'm not pressing charges. I just want this on the record, so that if something happens—" I didn't finish the sentence, but he understood. Saunders nodded, took the USB, and asked a few more questions about the time, location, and our relationship. I gave him all the details. I saw the professionalism in how he handled it, but also a quiet, unspoken respect. Maybe because not many women my age take such active steps to protect themselves. On the way home, I didn't stop at the grocery store like I usually did. I drove straight back. The rain was still a drizzle, and a light wind rustled the pine trees out front. I made myself a cup of cinnamon tea, sat in the armchair by the window, and looked out at the backyard. I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel worried. I just felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe for the first time in my life, I no longer held any hope for Brian and Chelsea, and that, strangely enough, was a relief. I received the letter on a May morning. The sun was gentle. The lavender by the porch had just bloomed, and the familiar squirrel was scurrying along the fence as usual. I was making tea when Sophie came out of her room holding a cream-colored envelope. She handed it to me without a word, just pointing to the top right corner where the return address was printed in an elegant script. Brian and Chelsea Whitaker, sent from my old address where they now lived. I didn't open it. I set it down on the dining table in the spot where Richard used to sit and asked, "Did they send this to you?" Sophie nodded. "It's not addressed to anyone specific, but I assume so." I looked at the envelope for a few more seconds. Maybe once I would have hoped for an apology like this, something decent. But I also understood that some things, when they come too late, have no value no matter how sincere. That afternoon I heard the clatter of a keyboard from Sophie's room. She stayed in there for a long time, skipping her afternoon snack and her favorite TV show. I didn't ask, just made some extra spaghetti for dinner and left her portion on the table. That evening, Sophie came out of her room holding her phone. She placed it on the table and said softly, "I posted it." I frowned. "Posted what?" "My parents' letter. Online. The letter and my response." I looked at her, my eyes wide. "What did you write?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Sophie didn't look down or away. She looked me straight in the eye, her voice steady. I wrote, "I am choosing to leave my parents not out of anger, but because I am tired of having to be on guard in my own family. A real family is where you are heard, loved, and protected, and where you don't have to apologize for being yourself. And Grandma, you are that place for me." I was speechless. A feeling bloomed in my chest, not quite joy, not quite sadness, just profound and full. Brian and Chelsea came to the house the next morning. I knew they would because Sophie had told me she'd left a note in her post. "If you want to talk, go see my grandmother." They didn't bring a gift, nor did they wear angry expressions. Just a forced smile and clothes that were neater than usual. Brian stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, while Chelsea stood behind him, clutching her purse, her eyes darting around the front yard as if looking for something to criticize. I opened the door. I didn't invite them in. Brian spoke first. "We just want to talk. No arguments, no threats. We just hope Sophie will give us a chance." I looked over at Chelsea. She was silent, her eyes still avoiding mine. I turned back to my son. "Sophie has already spoken. She has the right to choose where she belongs." Brian bit his lip and gave a slight nod. Then he turned and walked away without another word. That. On the morning of Sophie's graduation, I wore the navy blue dress Richard had bought me for our 40th wedding anniversary. I didn't have a fancy car or a designer handbag. Just a bouquet of purple tulips because Sophie said they were a flower that looked both regal and strong. The ceremony was held in the high school auditorium, the chairs packed tight, the stage brightly lit. I sat in the third row, clutching the bouquet, my eyes fixed on the stage. Names were called one by one as students in royal blue gowns walked up to receive their diplomas. Then the name rang out clear and full, Sophie Coraline Whitaker. I froze. Coraline. I had never heard her say she was changing her middle name, but now, hearing it announced in that hall, I knew she had made her choice. No questions needed, no explanation required. Sophie walked onto the stage, accepted her diploma, and then turned unexpectedly to look right at me. Her eyes were shining, her lips pressed into a gentle smile. I stood up. I wasn't sure if I should, but I couldn't stay seated. The people around me began to applaud. A woman next to me leaned over and whispered, "Is that your granddaughter? She's so beautiful and strong." I nodded, my eyes never leaving Sophie. After the ceremony, I waited for Sophie by the exit. She ran over and threw her arms around me, saying nothing for the first few seconds. Then she whispered in my ear, "You are my real family." I took her by the shoulders and looked into her face. "And you are the most beautiful thing this family has ever had." That night back home, I hung Sophie's diploma on the wall next to my wedding photo with Richard. There was an empty space between them. I filled it with a new picture, Sophie and me hugging the purple tulips between us, both of us smiling. No pretense, no regrets. I sat in my familiar armchair, set my teacup on the table, and looked up at Richard's photo. I don't know if he could see it, but if he could, he would probably smile, take a sip of his coffee, and say, "Evie, we couldn't save Brian, but we saved Sophie." I nodded, whispering back, "Yes. We did what a family is supposed to do. We saved what could be saved." If you've followed my story this far, then I know it has touched you in some way. I'm not telling this story to complain or to seek pity. I'm telling it because I believe that we women who have lived more than half our lives deserve to be heard. And sometimes it is in our weakest moments that we learn how to be truly strong. I used to think family was immutable, that my child, no matter how lost, would eventually find his way back, that if I just endured, just loved, just gave, everything would be okay. But the truth is, some children never learn to be decent people because we never taught them boundaries. Richard, my husband chose silence to protect me. In the end, I had to learn to speak up to protect myself. It was the most painful thing I've ever done, and also the most right. I'm not telling my story to stir up anger. I'm telling it to remind us all you are not wrong for choosing your self-respect over a relationship built on pain. You are not wrong for setting boundaries even with the child you once held in your arms. And if you are sitting somewhere in a house that was once full of laughter but is now filled with sighs, if you have been taken for granted, disrespected, and met with demands instead of gratitude by your own family, if you have ever asked yourself, am I being selfish for thinking of myself? Then I want to tell you no, you are not. We are not being selfish. We are simply learning to love ourselves completely and for the first time. Sophie, my granddaughter, taught me that. She chose to stay not because I was her grandmother, but because I was the only one who didn't hurt her. And I realized family isn't in our blood. Family is in how we treat each other every single day. Whether you are a grandmother, a mother, or just a woman, navigating life past 50 with a heart full of cracks, please believe this. There are still people who will see you, who will choose to stay with you, not out of duty, but out of true unconditional love. If you have gone through something similar to my story, whether it's being abandoned by your children or misunderstood by your family, I invite you to share a piece of your story in the comments. Or you can simply subscribe to hear more stories from grandmothers and mothers like us. Maybe here you'll find someone who understands. Have you ever had to redefine family for yourself? And if so, what helped you get through it? I will read every single word, because I believe every woman over 60 deserves a voice, and I am here to listen. Evelyn Whitaker, a grandmother, a mother, and finally, a woman who learned to stand up for herself.